Conversations across time. Conversations across.
Welcome to Conversations Across Time, the show that allows you, the viewer, to get a better understanding of historical events, and we actually invite actors to portray historical personalities. You will note that tonight's show is a little different. The format is different, and what we want to do, and when I say we, I am here with the show's historian. Listen, I guess I'm so honored that he's here to do this in his own personality. This is Mark Hoffman.
Hi.
And Mark Hoffman is a retired history teacher and just a free thinker who has always tried to get his students to think about history from another perspective. So as the show historian, as the historian for the entire show of Conversations Across Time, I am happy that we are here with Mark, and we are going to do something that is different from what our audience would expect. We're actually going to have a little lesson. And the reason for that is because we are talking about topics that are so important in today's environment. If you're a follower of the show, you know that the last two shows we've discussed warm water. We've discussed the Middle East. And so our idea is to give you an understanding of how to tie all of these things together. And we're going to do it, unfortunately, I'm a former school teacher, and Mark's a retired school teacher. And so I thought it would be helpful to you that we give you some bullet points and some understanding of the historical perspective of the show's content. So please follow along, take notes, and I hope that you enjoy this as much as we have enjoyed putting it together. So Mark, you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to start with what's going on now with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and the Crimea, and the Ukraine, and later on, Viv and I will talk about is what's going on in Syria. But for now, it's not easy, but to understand what Putin is doing. But we can understand it if we think about one fundamental principle: Russia's quest for warm water. Since Peter the Great became Tsar of Russia, Russia has looked to the west. Prior to that, Russia was an eastern country. Once Russia started to look to the west, she needed to find a warm water port for her commerce and for her naval transportation of military naval operations.
May I just ask you a question, Mark?
Yeah, sure.
Because up until the time of Peter the Great, Russia had identified as more of an
Eastern Oriental country. I don't like to use the term Oriental because it's not politically correct, but an Eastern country. She associated with China, Mongolia, and the Eastern people. She had very little contact with the European countries. She had some contact with the Scandinavian countries. So she basically, if you wanted to categorize her in today's terms, she would be more in line with China than she would be in line with Germany.
And that's interesting. And again, this is why it's so important that we have this discussion. And I interrupted you. So
No, that's fine, because it's important, because once she turns westward, she has to move southwest to gain control of the Black Sea and ports in the Black Sea, so that she can be she can have access to warm water. So it's imperative that Russia gains control of the ports in the Black Sea, and she's going to come into conflict with other countries. So once she gets control of the Black Sea, and to her north, she can't use that. To Russia's north, she has the Baltic Sea and the White Sea.
And I guess those are all frozen?
They're frozen 8 months to 9 months of the year.
Okay.
And Vivian, even when they're not frozen, the weather is so bad, it's so perilous that you'd have to put guns to seamen's head to even want to travel in that area. It's like going around the Cape of Good Hope and the Cape of Horn and all that stuff.
Sure.
So she had to have a warm water port. So that's why she moved to the Black Sea.
And this is the 17th century we're talking about?
Started the 17th century, and from then on, always, Russia was moving southwestward to the Black Sea. And she's going to come into conflict with different interests in that area, but that's where she's going. For example, in order to have ports and access on the Black Sea, Russia's going to have to control the Crimea and the Ukraine, which ties right into now.
Ties right into what's going on today and the
Exactly.
misunderstandings.
Right. So in order to have control of the Black Sea, she needs the Crimea, she needs Ukraine. Once she secures that, once she secures those ports and comes into conflict with the native groups in Ukraine and Crimea, the Tartars and stuff like that, she needs to go through the Black Sea and move towards the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus Straits, and she's going to come into conflict with Turkey, the Balkan states. When you look at the map, you'll see Bulgaria, but other states, Greece. And in fact, Vivian, in Russian history, up until the Russia-Turkish War, which was at the latter part of the 19th century, she went to war with Turkey 9 times. People don't know that. 9 times, because Turkey is to the east of the Bosphorus Straits and the Dardanelles.
And so in order to get to warm water.
Right. And once she got through that, and she passes through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, she would be in the Aegean Sea, and then she could go to the Mediterranean, and then they could have naval power and international trade.
And that, you know, you just hit on something. Naval power and international trade. We are caught up now in this discussion about Russia and what's wrong and what Putin is doing, and he's a madman. This is their history.
The analogy would be the same type of expansion the United States was engaged when we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast with Manifest Destiny, constantly moving across the country. Russia's quest was always southwestern. It didn't have to move eastern anymore. It came into conflict once with Japan, the Russo-Japanese War. But basically, and the European countries, because don't forget, Russia had more territory than anybody. She does not need land. She's big.
She's got land.
She's very big.
Okay.
And she doesn't need population. She has plenty of people, and she has plenty of resources. So if you have those 3 things, the only thing you're lacking is ports, access, warm water ports. So once she gets that, she's a threat now to Europe and to Britain's hegemony over the seas, and France's trade and the Dutch trade sometimes in history. So if you understand that Russia constantly wanted that, we can understand Putin and what's going on in the Crimea and what's going on in the Ukraine, and they will not give it up, especially at this point in history when free trade is so important, when the transportation of oil is so important. Russia is not giving that up. So to come in conflict with Russia over that is a really bad move. There's other problems that are far greater than that.
And let me understand, part of, you know, we grew up during the time when we always heard these horrible things about Russia and Russia's coming to get us. But when, as you just articulated, population, huge, land, huge, natural resources, huge. So it would make sense to me, looking at how statesmen would view Russia, they would always view Russia as a threat.
Absolutely.
And that's back to Peter the Great.
That's as soon as they turned westward and the European powers saw that what Russia had in resources and population. Don't forget the number of people Russia had. What kind of army could they have in those days, using all their manpower?
Sure.
So that she definitely became a threat to the European powers. So basically, France and England, and of course that was before the unification of Germany and Italy, they wanted to stymie her. Their goal was to keep her in her place.
Okay. That's a great explanation. And in last week's show, you were portraying Dostoevsky.
Right.
And for those of I mean, I know we have regular viewers that know the significance of Dostoevsky, because you're able, as that character, to articulate the necessity of Mother Russia.
Yeah,
being able to get to warm water.
And in the show, it was ironic that Putin always said that Dostoevsky was his favorite author. And Dostoevsky was a Russian nationalist. He believed in the Russian expansion and pan-Slavism. So when Russia expanded to the southwest, they came in contact with the Balkans, which were all the Slavic states. He believed Russia should dominate them. So the fact that Putin was not alive but loves Dostoevsky, Dostoevsky would love Putin. So there would be a mutual admiration society.
That's a good point for us to get to, because, as you know, in the climate today, we are hearing horrible things about Putin and his goals. And that's why it's important for us to have this conversation and give our audience the backdrop.
Absolutely. And while we don't have to side with Putin and we don't have to side with Russia or be their ally if we don't want to, what we need to understand is why. This is part of Russian history. You know, if you want to make an analogy, the United States has a sphere of influence. Latin America, Cuba, that
Yes.
area of the world. And early on in our history, we introduced a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine that said we don't want any European or outside interference in this area of the world. We'll take steps to stop it. Well, Russia's best interest in its sphere of influence is the Black Sea, the Crimea, Ukraine, and passage to warm water. And they view that as we view our Monroe Doctrine.
And our Monroe Doctrine is how old?
1810, 1812. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, looking at history from this prism gives you a different understanding of the United States' role and Russia's role.
Yeah, and the important thing is we don't have to say it's correct or we agree with it, but what we do have to do is understand it and say this is a natural thing for them to do. And maybe if we say it's a natural thing for them to do, it's part of their history, just like certain things are part of our history, that we would better understand and maybe get along and be able to do things with Putin and the Russians that would be in our self-interest, for example, to deal with the ISIS and the terrorism and other things that are going on in the world if we understand why he did it. That doesn't make it right, but at least we as a nation and we as a people would understand it.
And what we aim to do, and I say we as the CAT family, the Conversations Across Time family, aims to do is to just give people an understanding of world events.
Exactly.
And so, as you said, it's not that Russia's right and the United States is wrong. It's just being able to understand exactly what happens and what the political interests are. Because just we're able to rationalize. As a kid, I can remember in history being taught about manifest destiny. Think of what that term means. What it sounds like to an 11-year-old kid. I think that's about the time they introduced manifest destiny in the public school system, at least when I was in school. And manifest, just the idea that somehow this was from God and it was our destiny. God wanted us to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and it did not matter. And when I say us, I mean the United States government. And it didn't matter who the people, the indigenous people, we didn't care about that because it was ordained that the United States would have that.
Yeah,
land.
in fact, in the last show, if we can refer back to the last show, John Foster Dulles was talking about the fact that Putin infringed on the rights of the Ukrainians and the people that lived in the Crimea, and they had a right to be independent. But as you say, when the United States was engaged in manifest destiny, nobody cared about the Native Americans. Nobody cared it was their land. It was our right to do it because it was in our self-interest. That doesn't make it right. It's not that the Indians shouldn't be, looked at as being exploited. But we understand what the United States did, and it's no different than Putin's doing in the Ukraine or what the Russians had done before. Nations act in their own self-interest, and the fact that the European countries didn't want Russia to have warm water port had nothing to do with morality, because they were doing immoral things in terms of colonialization. They didn't want the competition. Again, I refer back to, not to be redundant, but I refer back to what I said before. They had people, they had resources, and they had land. All they needed was water.
And with that in mind, we look towards what's happening right now in the world. And we will, at a later point in our discussion, get to the Middle East and Syria and Russia's involvement in Syria. But if you could talk a little bit about the Ukraine, and I know in our show, I think in first episode of this, when we started talking about this topic, you, as Dostoevsky, mentioned the fact that the Ukraine, when there was a Soviet Union, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union.
It was. It was part of the Soviet Union, and Nikita Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, gave them semi-independence. But he always knew that they would allow him
Access.
access to the warm water ports. Of course, like any country, there's nationalistic movements, and they don't want influence from outside sources. So in the Ukraine, they started to build up nationalistic movements that were anti-Russia because of some of the things that happened when they were under the Soviet Union. That presented a threat to Putin and to their access to warm water. In fact, he was afraid, perhaps down the road, that the Ukraine would become part of NATO, which is an alliance of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, European countries, with the United States, which would be devastating.
And be certainly not in the best interest for Mother Russia.
Right, but it would be a coup for the Western powers, especially the United States, to have the Ukraine as part of North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Almost like what would have happened if the Soviets were able to maintain their presence in Cuba.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why the United States got its back up and was so adamant about getting the Soviet Union or Russia out of Cuba, and why we almost went to nuclear war over it, but we had sanctions against Cuba up until, 6 months ago?
Yes.
Because it was a foreign influence in our sphere of interest, and it's the same thing
that Russia's experiencing right now with Ukraine.
Exactly.
And obviously, because it was a foreign interest in our sphere of influence, that was contrary to the Monroe Doctrine,
yes,
which has existed
violated
since
the Monroe
1810.
Doctrine. And I'm sure if I'm no expert in Soviet history, but I'm sure if we were teachers in Moscow and we were doing a class in Russian history, they have some name for the doctrine that gives them the right to control the Ukraine. And I don't know what it is, but I'm sure maybe some of our viewers know. But I'm sure that the Russians have a name for the policy and the doctrine, of whatever the doctrine would be.
That would allow Russia. And when you say that, maybe some of our viewers, what I'm hopeful is that now that we have Conversations Across Time is moving into, thank you, it took us a long time to get there, but now that we're moving into the internet and having our own website, we may hear from some viewers that can give us the exact name. I do know we have a sizable Russian population that watches this show. Yeah. That I do know.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so
that's great.
So
but
to
I'm
our
just saying,
viewers,
I'm sure that they whatever we'll call it, the Stoli doctrine for the Viking, but whatever it is.
How about the Kettle One doctrine?
Yeah,
I sort of like that.
Yeah.
I sort of like that name. So I interrupted you. Is there anything?
All we have to remember is that is their movement from to the southwest to the Black Sea, from the Black Sea past Turkey and the Balkan states, through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits to the Aegean Sea, Mediterranean. Then they can go to the Atlantic Ocean, or they can go westward to the Pacific Ocean, and they're free to trade and have naval maneuvers. And of course, they're going to want naval bases elsewhere, which we'll probably talk about later. But that gives them access, that gives them power, that gives them trade, which gives them economic ability to build a larger army. And that's why they've always been a threat. And that's why no one wanted to have those ports. If you have trade and you have money, you can build a better army. Remember what I said at the beginning. They had land, manpower, and resources, so they could really be a big threat, especially before technology, when land armies and the number of men you had were paramount to victory. They were really a threat to the European powers.
When you talk about them being a threat to the European powers, it's always been interesting to me that, and on this show, for our viewers will remember, we did have a discussion with the Tsar Nicholas.
Yeah.
And with Alexei, who was of Russian nobility, and I believe John Foster Dulles. And at that time, one of the things that was expressed was simply that when the Communist Party came into power in Russia, Russia was the richest monarchy in Europe. Richest monarchy in Europe. I mean, that there was this disparity, and they were trying to move along and do some things to propel the underclass to have some more rights. But I think it was an unfortunate timing that the Tsar was off fighting in the First World War, that the Bolsheviks were able to come to power. But Russia, just as you just articulated and have given us the reason, was the richest monarchy in Europe.
Other than when Lenin surrendered before the end of World War I at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, if you eliminate that and the Russian Revolution, the fight between the Reds and the White Armies, the communist, the Soviet policy in terms of foreign policy, warm water ports, movement in that direction, is no different than the Tsarist policy. It's exactly the same. And they want to control that area. In fact, at the Malta Conference at the end of World War II, Stalin did not want an invasion in Normandy. He wanted the Second Front. But Stalin wanted the Allies to move up through the Balkans into Germany. I'm sorry, Churchill wanted to do that, and Stalin put the negativity on that. Stalin said, no, we want you to come into Normandy because he would, and he controlled it anyway after the war. After the war, because they didn't listen to Churchill, the Russians moved through the Balkan states, and all those states were communist after World War II. And that's no different than the Tsarist policy. Before World War I, the Tsarist policy was to foment unrest in the Balkans, to disrupt the Austro-Hungarian control of that area, so to guarantee that they would have access to the Straits and to the Dardanelles. So the Soviet policy is no different than the Tsarist policy in terms of foreign policy, except for that brief period when they had to internalize and fight their own revolution. So it's exactly the same. So if you just focus on warm water, they need warm water, they have everything else. Doesn't matter if it's communism, Tsarism, whatever ism.
Nationalism, any kind of ism.
They're going to follow their same policy in terms of foreign relations.
What I find interesting about that is that the unrest that has happened in the Balkans for all of these years, now that you've just explained it, of course it makes sense, that you can understand why outside interests would want to foment difficulty between
for their own interests.
For their own interests.
It's better for Russia to have a divided Balkans because one small ethnic nation like Bulgaria cannot challenge a large power like Russia, but if it's controlled by Austro-Hungarian, which is a large, powerful military nation at the time, they can challenge Russian hegemony. So it's to their interest to keep it weak. And it's the same thing, every country was like that. On their borders, they were like a lot of weak little countries with no power. Russia's no different than any other country. Which
is, I am thinking that when we start to talk about the Middle East, that is precisely what we see happening with the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly.
It's no different. And it's just world politics. And I suppose if there is nothing else that Conversations Across Time does for our audience is to give you a backdrop to view these world events and reach your own conclusions, but certainly be aware that these are the way that political operations happen. This is in order to maintain power, then countries will do this. They will foment strife in their border countries. Think about how much that's happened. Think about what happens in Central America right now, and all of the strife that goes on. Well, it's in America's best interest that they're fighting each other. I mean,
well, I think it came up in the last show as well. John Foster Dulles was talking about the morality. I think the words he used was to uplift the native populations of the other. I think that's the word he used, and. Sure, we use excuses. It's uplift the native population, but all countries, when they expand in their own self-interest. They could care less about the native populations if they didn't have resources or something
Something they want.
They could care. It's the same thing, when countries say we want self-determination, we want these countries to be able to govern themselves. No, they don't. They say we want it because it's better for us.
We want to control, and we want to control the politics of these various countries.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned a character that's on the panel with us, and that's John Foster Dulles. And I think...
I think you used the right word, character.
Yeah, the character. I want to take some time, and fortunately, through the use of technology, you're going to be able to see some important facts about John Foster Dulles. But I want you to just jump in at any time.
Okay, go ahead.
John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower from 1953 to 1959. Now, the backdrop on that is that President Eisenhower, who has been a guest on this show, when he was General Eisenhower, was not particularly interested in being president. But the Republican Party needed, as they do today, they need an individual that had credentials and that could run in a contested presidential election that the public was going to feel comfortable with. And Dwight Eisenhower was grandfatherly, and of course he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces. And so consequently they settled on Dwight Eisenhower, but with the caveat that John Foster Dulles was going to have to be the Secretary of State. So John Foster Dulles comes to the office of Secretary of State with a lot more power than a traditional Secretary of State. You would agree?
Absolutely, and it's, and one of the things you're saying or you're alluding to is he's old line, old blood Republicans.
Yes.
Eisenhower was electable, but they didn't know really where he stood on a lot of these issues. But they knew Dulles, his brother, and his family were old line Republicans, and they knew where he stood on foreign policy, and he knew what he would do in foreign policy.
And they had a certain amount of security with him.
Yeah, exactly, because he would do what they wanted. I mean, it was just like today if they wanted to put up a straw man for president, and they made sure the neocons would be Secretary of State. And you might even say that your friend, Mr. Dulles, was the first neocon.
And I agree with you. And I think we might have mentioned that on the show.
Yeah, I think you did.
John Foster Dulles was a lawyer, and he was a lawyer with a powerful law firm. And the name of the law firm was Sullivan and Cromwell. Now, I'm going to challenge our viewers because there is there's wonderful research done by two people that I know well. And that is Nancy Iskar and Frank Lipschitz actually wrote a book about John Foster Dulles and the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a firm of their own, I think, may have been the title of the book. But please, Frank, forgive me if I have the title of that book. But you really should read that book because it gives you some background on the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell represented many clients who invested in Nazi Germany. The quote that I like most is, chief agent for the banking circles that rescued, describing John Foster Dulles as chief agent for the banking circles that rescued Adolf Hitler from the financial debts and set up his, being Hitler's, Nazi party as a growing concern. Those are not my words. Those are words by Drew Pearson, who was a columnist. So when we come back, I want to give you some more information on John Foster Dulles, but I think that you really do need to, if you want to examine the history of this country, you have got to examine John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA. So with that,
you can't control much more foreign policy than being Secretary of State and head of the CIA.
And head of the CIA. Isn't that amazing?
Family.
Same family.
And
Same family.
People made a big deal about John Kennedy and Bobby.
Yes.
And they didn't say boo about this.
Said nothing about John. In fact, there's even an airport in Washington, D.C. named after Dulles. And I view him as someone that if the public really knew what he and his ilk were up to, that they would at the very least clamor to have that name, the name of the airport, changed. So this has been Mark Hoffman and Vivian Crawford, and we invite you to come back next week when we will give you more information on the Middle East, John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles and their involvement in what is happening today in Middle Eastern politics, in fact, in world politics. Thank you.